Hello, everyone. It is such an honor to be here and an even greater privilege to have served on the board with these wonderful people. You're in good hands. I had to come up with the title for this talk several months ago. And I usually spend a lot of my time in environmental health reports. And I decided that the title should have to do with this boiling frog syndrome. Now, by a show of hands, does everybody know what the boiling frog syndrome is? Well, for those who don't remember what it is, it's a story, it's a metaphor for what happens when people have the inability to recognize that they're in trouble because the change that occurs is so gradual. So normally there's, 2 pots of water, you put a frog in one that's boiling, the frog will jump out. But if you put a frog in a pot of water and gradually turn up the heat, then you start seeing damage, and the frog doesn't know it until it's too late. And I don't know about you, but that's how I feel a lot of times, especially living here in the Midwest in the Mississippi River watershed. So we'll talk about that. I did not get a clicker. Okay. I like to be in control of my own slides. The best person, I think, who really understands. Oh, thank you. The best person who really explained this to me was Robert Shimmick. Is Robert Shimmick here by any chance? Robert Shimmick is a Native American, and he lives on the White Earth Reservation in the Pine Point community. And he tells the story of what it's like to live near 50,000 acres of potatoes that are grown by the RDO company. Their biggest purchaser is McDonald's. And what's happened is that the potatoes are now sprayed 5 to 7 times per week, if I'm understanding him correctly, during the growing season with a fungicide. And the children are getting sick. And some of the people are dying. And the animals have been dying. And I was doing this interview with him, and I said, well, gosh, Mr. Shimmick, aren't the parents outraged? And he said, well, you'd think they would be. But it's happened over so many years that it's become the normal. A little bit of sickness, a little bit of dying, a little bit more sickness, a little more dying, and people from the outside can see it, but they've lost the ability to see it within their own community. And so I put the number up here for the McDonald's headquarters. Look at us, we are thousands of people here. I mean, I can be a whining mom, and I can call, and I can say, I really want you to make your Happy Meals organic. But if all of you call McDonald's and say, you know what, there are kids in this community where you're buying your potatoes, and they're getting sick. You can call that number and say, if you really want to make a Happy Meal, make it an organic meal, and take the chemicals out. McDonald's was just tooting its own horn lately that they were lowering the calories in their food. They're taking the cheese off the kids' meals, they're shrinking the size of the fries, but they're not talking about this. And I think we all have a responsibility for those children. The second person who really helped me see this frog in the boiling water syndrome is Lou Gillette. Lou Gillette is no longer with us. He spoke at a Beyond Pesticides Forum meeting, where I learned that, he was studying alligators, which allowed him to fly under the radar, actually, of his university administrators. And he found that alligators that were living in toxic Lake Apopka, Florida, this is where there had been some agricultural chemical spills, those alligators differed from alligators that were growing in cleaner water. And the same problems that he was seeing in alligator ovaries and alligator testes were the same problems that they were witnessing in the clinics at the University of Florida. And what he said to me, which probably should have been obvious, but it wasn't, he said, an ovary is an ovary. A testy is a testy. It's the same structure and function. So paying attention to what's happening to these sentinel species is really important for us and our children's future. In 2009, when the Brownfield News Network was celebrating 50 years of atrazine, at the same time, Paul Winchester, who's a neonatologist in Indiana, published a paper showing that women who conceive babies during the early spring and summer months, when atrazine spraying is at its highest, those women are more likely to have babies with birth defects. Now, I'm going to spare you the images of the babies that Dr. Winchester shows you, but I can tell you that once you see them, you never forget. And that's the thing, is you can't, once you learn this, you can't forget it. You can't unsee it. And so the research that Tyrone Hayes was doing years before Syngenta was saying, hey, aren't we great? Tyrone Hayes was finding that atrazine feminizes male frogs. Frogs are sentinel species. What happens to amphibians very likely happens to us, given enough time. So I'm a big fan of media literacy. I've been looking at the way media influences how we think about food and farming for many years. And I really love this idea that for us to look at media messages really critically and to see them as both reflections and creators of reality. They paint the cultural narratives for us. And it is important for us to pay attention. In the model of the precautionary principle, pay attention and heed warnings. So, what are some signs of our times? Maybe we weren't looking at the research from Tyrone Hayes. Maybe we didn't know about Lou Gillette. How would we know that something's gone awry? How do we know that the water is heating up? Well, the Star Tribune in 2015 had an article that said, in farm country, tainted water is just the way it is. Excuse me? Just the way it is? Water is our most important nutrient. And what is a summer without the ability to wade in a creek with your kids, or put a canoe in the water, or swim, or swing off a rope swing? This is quality of life. No more fishing? We can't eat the fish in our water? That's not right. What about these signs of the times? This is a billboard in Nebraska for Enogen corn. It's corn that's been genetically engineered to contain the amylase enzyme. Any small amount of contamination with food-grade corn, it will contaminate it and make it so that we can't eat it. So this whole myth of feeding the world, are we feeding the world ethanol? That's not right. And then what about this sign? In Arkansas, farmers need dicamba? Since when? Are there no alternatives? So for the last, maybe 10 years, I've been starting to take pictures of all the cancers, the children's cancer centers that I've seen. You know, if I see a flyer up in a supermarket for a fundraiser for a little boy that can't afford his cancer treatments, I take a picture of it. If I see an ad in a hospital magazine that now we have MRI machines that are designed for children so that they're not so frightened, they make it all look like a little trip to Disneyland. I am so tired of seeing these pictures increase everywhere. Children with cancer. That's not right. That tells me that water is getting hotter, and we need to do something about it. The CDC, if you look at that chart on the right, let's say you don't go to the CDC website. Let's say you never saw the graph that shows it's now 1 in 68 kids that's going to be diagnosed in the autism spectrum disorder. Let's say you never saw that. All you have to do is look around. There are billboards, buildings being turned into autism academies. Billboards recognizing the fact that, oh my gosh, we've got an urgent crisis here. That's what the American Academy of Pediatrics says. And maybe you didn't notice, but Sesame Street has a new character, Julia, and she has autism. That is a wake-up call that something in our environment has changed. What is it? It's probably not one thing. It's probably many things, but we should start examining this. This is heeding warnings. New normals. I was just having a conversation last night. What is it about all of these digestive disorders? You know, when I started as a clinical dietitian back in 1980, I could count on one hand how many people could not tolerate gluten. In fact, I remember 2 patients exactly. And now you can't go into a supermarket and not see a whole aisle dedicated to gluten-free. And look at probiotics and all kinds of digestive aid supplements. This is new. These probiotics are one of the top-selling supplements today. That wasn't the case 30 years ago. Something has changed. The water is getting warmer. So the way I see it through my dietitian public health lens is that we've got 5 urgent food, health, farming crises. And I got to tell you something. The answer to every single one of them is in this room. Organic farming is the answer to help alleviate these problems. Let's go through them quickly. Climate change. Climate change has been called a medical emergency and also an opportunity to sequester carbon in soil. That's what you're doing. Antibiotic resistance, identified by the World Health Organization, a global problem. Antibiotics aren't working anymore because 80% of them are given to animals, 70% of them are given to animals to increase feed efficiency, to get them fatter, faster to market, more cheap food. That's not. Microbial integrity, connecting these dots between what happens in the soil, what happens to the plant microbiome, and in our own guts. And guess what? There's this gut-brain axis. So if we have a healthy gut, we've got a healthy brain. They're connected. And 70% of our immune system is in our gut. So every time I hear about somebody having another inflammatory bowel syndrome diagnosis, I think we need to look at the environment. What's going on? Environmental contaminants are something that probably wakes me up at night more than anything, and it's because I live, like you, in the Mississippi watershed where there is so much herbicide and pesticide use. So we've seen all the pictures of the soybean, collapse and the leaves being destroyed from pesticide drift. But I'm not seeing enough in the news about vegetable destruction and fruit destruction, the medical foods that I recommend to people to stay well and to support a healthy gut. So we'll see some pictures of that in a minute. And then finally, this loss of biodiversity, which John touched on, that has everything to do with resilience. And resilience is so important, especially during times of climate upheaval. We need to be able to bounce back. So all of this is going on at a time when who knows what to believe in the news media, right? I mean, I brought with me a newspaper column title, Washington Post, May 1st of 2017, Why Your Organic Milk May Not Be Organic. The National Organic Coalition tried to publish a rebuttal, a response to this, and the Washington Post didn't publish it. Here's one from the Wisconsin State Journal in October. Personal finance, save by skipping needless organics. Needless organics? We just looked at all of the things that organic is helping. We need to be doing full cost accounting to see all of the benefits that organic affords us. So we have a Monsanto auditorium at the University of Missouri. And several years ago, Dr. Roger Beachy spoke there. And he is with the Danforth Foundation. I don't know if you know about, or the Danforth Plant Center in St. Louis. They're funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They're financed by the Monsanto Fund. He publicly speaks out against organics as being, they're not safe. He's concerned about that. So he's very much pro-biotech. And he was talking to a group of mostly professors in the plant and agriculture sciences department. And he said, yeah, we really need biotechnology if we're going to feed the world, yada, yada. We've heard this a gazillion times ad nauseum. And that how, we were promised that biotechnology was going to reduce the need of herbicides, which we're living proof that's not the case. But he said one thing that was true. He said, we need to talk to consumers to make sure they want what you're doing. Bingo. They've figured it out. They know they have to reach consumers, and we do too. So how are we going to do that? Well, I've got 5 strategies. The first one is going to take a little bit longer, and we'll slide through the other 4. But we need to sharpen our tools. We all have this toolbox. It's free. It's ours, and we need to sharpen these tools. Our fork, but our fork is limited by the choices we have available to us. So I'd like to focus on the voice, the pen, and the camera. This is how we are going to shift consumer awareness about the good that you're doing. So we have to eat together. Educate, advocate, and translate. Each one of us have a responsibility because each one of us knows something about the puzzle that we can help consumers better understand. So the first thing we have to do is we have to call out inconsistencies. Remember, media creates cultural narratives. They create reality. So this is an advertisement in one of the farm magazines, advertising headline, which is a leading fungicide. It's a carcinogen. Notice who they chose to put in the ad. A little girl. This was by design. This is how media literacy works. You ask, who owns the message? Why was this particular ad designed the way it was? Why put a little girl in a cornfield that has been sprayed with a fungicide that's a carcinogen? So what I did was I looked at the headline report, and I looked at their label, because I like to read labels. Hazardous to humans and domestic animals. Warning, may be fatal if swallowed. Avoid contact with skin, eyes, clothing. Harmful if absorbed through the skin. Keep out of reach of children. Wouldn't you want to grab her out of there? How about the Farm Journal? Here's an interesting one. Big, strong farmer. Probably looks like a lot of you farmers, right? Making affirmations of how he is going to use multiple herbicides to beat back resistant weeds. I will use multiple herbicides, he's saying. And you can see he's certainly using a lot of glyphosate. In 2016, the New York Times had an article in which Monsanto was quoted saying that the corn seed of 2025 will have 14 traits that allow farmers to spray 5 different herbicides. Is that the direction we want to go? I don't want to raise kids in that environment. I don't think it's safe. So we need to make a change. And then I started thinking about how not only this farmer, but all of us really, dietitians who are targeted by Monsanto. There's a webinar coming up, going to be sponsored by Monsanto, teaching dietitians about an outdated toxicological perspective. The dose makes the poison. That's outdated. They're going to be teaching us about pesticides and their safety according to EPA regulations. But I think that we are all pawns. We've all been pawns for profit. And I looked up the definition of pawn. It's a person used by another for their own end. And I don't think that's right. I've always been a consumer advocate for as long as I can remember, and I don't think it's right to take advantage of people when it's hurting them and you're making money on their backs, as John alluded to earlier. This is a really scary place. I know this, and I know many of you probably do too. Maybe you've visited there yourself. Maybe you've been there with a child. Maybe you've been there with a loved one, a parent. The farmer's cancer is non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Not because a farmer is living a healthy life, but because a farmer is more exposed to any number of pesticides and herbicides. I don't want any of you to end up here unless you're going in for a physical or a well baby check. The International Agency of Research on Cancer has given glyphosate a probable carcinogen label. And Monsanto is working very hard to destroy the credibility of this organization. This organization has a lot of respected scientists. You can believe what they say. Glyphosate is a probable carcinogen. And we're not even talking about the adjuvants and these inerts that go along with these herbicides. So do you remember when Vice President Joe Biden came out, he said, we're going to have a moonshot to cure cancer. I never heard the word prevention. Again, we're going to, these posters, you may not be able to read them in the back, but it's all about saving lives, fighting cancer, giving money, finding cures. We know how to at least have some impact with environmental health, and that's through prevention. And the President's Cancer Panel report didn't get nearly as much media as it deserved. What did it say? Well, without using the O word, it said, eat food that hasn't been sprayed with chemicals or grown with synthetic fertilizers. Don't use antibiotics. Don't use hormones. Filter your water. Oh, by the way, farmers and children are at greater risk. And use your voice. That's the recommendation. Follow the precautionary principle and know who the most vulnerable populations are. Pregnant women and children. They are at greater risk. And our wombs, they're our first environment. This summer, we saw the eclipse in Columbia, Missouri. It was really beautiful. It was surreal. And I think what it did was it made me realize how interconnected we all are with areas, different aspects of the universe. But I want to use it to say we should not be eclipsed by propaganda. So if you look at the poster on the left, this is from Monsanto, sustaining our bond with Mother Nature, and the man is holding up some soil. That's not the reality. The reality is increasing herbicides on soil. What is that going to do to the microbes in the soil and the microbes in us? Look for patterns, connect the dots, and talk about this. So I was curious, I was looking at this report from the University of Vermont that looked at parts of the country that have low abundance and high abundance of wild bees. And all the areas in yellow have lost wild bees. And I thought, where have I seen that pattern before? That looks so familiar to me. And I thought, oh yes, I'll go and look at the USGS maps and the USDA pesticide use maps, and lo and behold, it's the same places where we have high use of pesticides and herbicides. We have lower wild bee populations. Can we say cause and effect? No. But we can say, that looks like a correlation we might want to study. Now, I'm a big believer in using art to change the way we think about food and farming. It's just so much. Art creates empathy and beauty and joy in our lives. And I really didn't make this connection until I went to a Bioneers conference and I heard an artist talk about how important art was to change the way a society thinks, and then we can launch into changing policy. And I thought, oh, this is brilliant. So let me give you some examples. This is Toril Fisher. She has a farm called Second Cloud on the left. She is one of the most talented artists I know. And she did a series of paintings on bee boxes that she found in the woods. So these were lids from beehives. And the reason why she used the beehive lids to paint on was because she said, we just keep approving all of these new herbicides and pesticides and our bees are in trouble. Maybe I'll use this as a way to get through. And then she used part of the money that she raised selling this beautiful artwork, and she donated that to the Xerces Society. This is art for good. This is art for humanity. It's just what Toril wants. If you've ever been to the museum in Arkansas, Crystal Bridges, there's a wonderful, it takes up the whole wall length, and it's called the Silver Upper White River. So sometimes we can use art to give us historical perspectives on what used to be. So this was done, Maya Lin is actually the artist who did the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., the big black wall where you can go up and touch the names of all the men, the lost potential. And this river was so named the Silver Upper White River because it was so full with fish that it appeared to be silver from the fish scales. And you go to this river today, and it's still a lovely river, but my gosh, it's not silver anymore. So art gives us historical perspective. This is my grandfather, David Carfunkel, and in 1936, he painted a mural in the Harlem County Courthouse titled The Hoarding of Wealth and the Exploitation of Labor. In 1936, that holds true today, too, doesn't it? So sometimes what art can do is it can help us see the human condition so that we can take action. This is a project that I work on with my husband, Dan. He's a photographer. It's called Farm, Food Art Revolution Media. He takes the photographs. I do the interviews. These are note cards and shameless promotion. They are for sale in the bookstore. But most importantly, we did this project to amplify farmers' voices, and we knew we could do it better if we had a beautiful photograph to draw people in. So let me read to you the back of some of these cards. So the woman with the beautiful black lentils in her hands, her name is Sini Berhanu. She's from Ethiopia. And she says she uses organic ingredients because she wants to make food that is good for humanity. So you send a card, you keep the U.S. Postal Service alive, and then the person looks at the back and says, oh, wow, that's really an interesting perspective on farming. And then this is my friend Dan Kibler from Columbia, Missouri. He was our first farmer that we photographed. The title is Sentinel of the Soil. And when I said, Dan, why do you farm organically? He said, you know, I want to love Mother Earth. She has cared and provided for me, and it's my responsibility to care for her. Again, you send a note, but you also amplify a farmer's voice. That's what art can do for us. How about a Christmas card? I thought I was the only one that sent advocacy notes and Christmas cards. We all do that, right? We are now. So this is Doug Crabtree and his lovely wife, Anna Crabtree, Anna Jones Crabtree. And I don't know if you can read the middle. It says, happy farmers plus happy soil microbes equal hope. What a great holiday message, right? This is peace on earth right here. And then in the letter that goes along with it, he says, invest in the people who invest in the soil where your food comes from. Great. So next year, all of our Christmas cards and holiday letters probably should have a little bit of advocacy, don't you think? Oh, and on farm advocacy, this is brilliant. So Dave Vetter's farm is in Nebraska. And I love this. Dave has his own sign up, and it says at the very bottom, how your food is produced does matter. Yay, this is right. This is exactly right. This is the message from me to consumers and from farmers to consumers. It matters. Wendell Berry said to care about food, but not how it's produced, it doesn't make sense. So if you go to Dave Vetter's farm, this is where I learned about Enogen and how dangerous it is, and the work that Dave has to do to protect his organic grain from contamination, and the onus falls on him. There's no, where is our government protecting the commons? This isn't fair to Dave. You know, Dave is keeping us well. He's protecting groundwater. He's protecting birds and frogs and all of the creatures that keep us resilient. And yet he is under threat. Okay, step 2. I had go outside, and then I saw this picture of kids outside with their little cell phones, and I thought, no, it has to be outside. You have to go outside and then embrace the beauty and be in awe and wonder. And it doesn't take a lot of money to take kids out in nature. And those of you who live on farms, you experience this every day. But I saw some statistics on how long kids are spending on screens. They're getting virtual reality. So if poor kids spend more time, about 8 hours a day, it's called iGen, and richer kids about 5 hours a day. It's interesting, Bill and Melinda Gates and all of those in Silicon Valley, they are restricting their children's access to these machines until they're about in 8th grade, 14, in that area. We should all be really cognizant of the damage that happens when we are removed from nature. So look at this. I mean, you have to be outside to see the bees and to see these incredibly gorgeous birds. And that's my dad. Thank goodness for him for taking me out in a fishing boat and having me hook worms and just be bored and stare up at the sky all day. You know, I mean, that's great. That's what kids need. And then, look at my own son. He caught a fish, and we opened its mouth, and there were little minnows in it. Like, that's how we see that we're all connected. But we have to see what's also been damaged. And this leaf on the right, that comes from a friend of mine's farm, Margot McMillan, who's got grapes. And that was her grapevine. I believe that was 2,4-D damage that drifted on her farm. We have to know what the true normal is in order for us to see what the abnormal and the changed environment is. Now, this past fall, there's a wonderful chestnut festival that happens through the University of Missouri Agroforestry Department. And Kevin Bradley is in the Weed Science Department, and one of his students, Brian Dintelman, presented numerous slides. They're doing research on the harm of both 2,4-D and dicamba drift on assorted trees. Fruit trees, you know, elderberries, apples, peaches, strawberries, pecans, you know, the things that I recommend as a dietitian that we eat to keep our gut healthy and to stay well and strong so we don't go into the doctor's office. Look at these trees at different levels of dicamba drift. If we don't have peach trees, we don't have peaches. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to live a summer without a peach, because that makes living so much better to have a fresh peach. Now, did you know also that farmers are getting a reimbursement, financial incentive to destroy our peaches? That's not right. Third, we need to bring people together. How many medical doctors are here? Registered nurses. Registered dietitians. Yay, my friends. It's really important for us to cross-pollinate. It's important for doctors to know that they may see people when they're in the clinic, when they're sick, but I want all of you never ever to say that you're just a farmer. What you are practicing preventive medicine. By feeding me well, you keep me well. By feeding your community, forget about the world. Let's feed our communities one community at a time with nutritious organic food, and let's see what changes happen. We have to connect. The other thing is, you know, we've got these bench scientists. If you do a Google on scientists, you'll get this guy coming up, a white man in a white lab coat. That's how our culture views scientists. But the farmer never comes up. The farmer is a field scientist, and the best studies are done when these two professions are communicating and have equal respect for each other. Ditto with the doctors and nurses. We need to see that we're all in this together. Oh, number 4, support young farmers. Thank you very much, Young Farmers Coalition, for doing your report. You just did the hard work. You asked, what is it going to take for you to be successful? Well, you got to have access to land. And I'd like to throw in here that you've got to have access to land that isn't contaminated or destroyed by drift. You've got to have somebody maybe forgiving your student loans. You've got to have labor. You've got to have access to labor, and you've got to pay the labor fairly. Because in order for the labor to be able to purchase food with dignity, they need to make a living wage. And guess what? You've got to have access to health insurance. You've got to have access to health care. You're young people. You're going to be having babies. The best thing that the Rosman family said, in my opinion, during the news conference today, was when I asked, what do you do for health insurance? And what was the response? The response was, well, I depend on the Affordable Care Act. Call it the Affordable Care Act. If calling it Obamacare divides us, then stop calling it that. Call it humanity taking care of humanity. We need access to health care. So the word of the year for 2017, according to the Oxford dictionaries, is youthquake. Let's run with that, shall we? Because the youth are the ones that are going to have to clean up this mess. It's on you, and I have been so inspired by what young people are doing, including my own daughter at the University of Missouri in agroforestry, teaching high school teachers the alternative methods to growing with chemicals. Number 5, in order for farmers and eaters to unite, we have to organize, cooperate, and participate. Think about Dolores Huerta and her work with Cesar Chavez for justice for farm workers. And think about the grape boycott. If you're not old enough to remember that, you can Google it and learn about how consumers and farm workers together worked for justice by boycotting grapes. How about Lentil Underground, our keynote speaker last year, who spoke about a community in Montana who, by cooperating and not competing, actually were able to make a go of it. And then 3 little women in Wisconsin, Chris, Della, and Lisa, working with our government to make it so that you can actually sell baked goods and, oh, by the way, make a living from it. And then Moses. You know, honestly, when I came to my first Moses meeting, I found hope here. I have never been to a meeting where people were more genuine, more sincere, more dedicated to helping each other. And oh, by the way, there's organic food and there's composting. That's huge. So we are all in this together. That's Molly Rockman's farm. And all of the beautiful people who've come together from all walks of life to learn how to produce good food, organic food. And together, what Food Sleuth Radio does is it brings all of these voices together. Many of you in this room are pictured on here. You've been my 30-minute victims for an interview, and I've so appreciated what I've learned from you. The mission of Food Sleuth Radio, we think we've done 450 interviews, and it airs on about 50 radio stations nationwide, mostly through Pacifica. I could not do this also without my husband, who is my tech guy as well. Thank you. But the mission is to connect the dots between food, health, and agriculture. And each one of the interviews is a puzzle piece of the larger food system. So if you go online and you just do Food Sleuth Radio, it'll come up. You can listen online. It's also via podcast. And thanks to Roger Blobaum, many of these interviews are going to be archived with the Wisconsin Historical Society so that we have an archive of farmers' voices, for young people throughout the future. Well, there was a wonderful interview that I did with Kathleen Dean Moore. And she's a philosopher and an environmentalist. And I want to read to you what she said because it's so beautiful. And I won't remember it on my own. She said, we have a moral obligation to not wreck the earth. A moral obligation to future generations. Can you imagine not having this in your life because the water is contaminated, the fish can't be eaten, the butterflies are gone? I mean, these are beautiful creatures, and they make life worth living. And Kathleen Dean Moore, she said, we're paying the costs of destructive industries with our health and our children's futures while the captains of industry make fortunes, and that's not fair. I highly recommend anything that Kathleen Dean Moore has written. I'll end with this quote from my friend Bernadette Dryden. She said, "There's no better way to care for the planet, its people, and the generations who come after us than to be fully conscious of each and every decision we make about our food and therefore our farming choices." So I want to thank you for listening to me. I want to thank you for doing the hard work that you do, the diligence, the vigilance, the persistence, the resistance that it's going to take to survive and create really good food for humanity going forward. Thank you all very much.